What's up, everybody? My name is Dimitri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and to learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. I had the awesome pleasure last week to be interviewed at the ETH Global Hack Money Summit by a widely respected researcher and writer in crypto whose work I've relied on to educate myself on some of the most important issues in the space over many years. That individual goes by the name of Hasu. He's a research collaborator at Paradigm, a general editor at Debris Insights, and co-hosts the Uncommon Core podcast. For those of you who listened to my recent appearance on the Grant Williams podcast, which I also published to the Hidden Forces podcast feed, I had a chance to elaborate on some of those same themes with Hasu, though this one is much more focused on crypto and how some of those same forces of nihilism or the gamification or casinofication of markets, so to speak, have shown up in this new asset class. I think it's a really great conversation, which is why I'm replaying it for all of you here today. Kudos to Hasu for being such a great interviewer, and thanks to the folks at ETH Global for having me on to talk about what I think are some of the most important issues facing not only crypto, but markets and society at large. You can follow Hasu on Twitter at HasuFL, that's HASUFL, and you can learn more about ETH Global and how to attend any one of their upcoming events, conferences, or hackathons at ethglobal.co. And as always, you can follow me on Twitter at Kofinas, and you can subscribe to our mailing list, explore our episode library, and subscribe to our premium content at hiddenforces.io.
For those who don't know me, I'm a research collaborator at Paradigm. I'm also the editor of Deribit Research, and I host the Uncommon Core podcast. And Dimitri, I'm extremely excited to talk to you today. I'm a big fan of your podcast.
Likewise, Hasu.
Thank you. In your episodes, you're not afraid to tackle some of the most complex and important topics in the world. And I feel like you approach them from a first principles point of view and with a very open mind. And that I think is very rare today. So why don't we start by you telling us a bit about, what you do at Hidden Forces and what your mission is.
So I'm always bad at these questions, but essentially the podcast, as you know, it's a long form conversation type podcast. I try and find experts or really brilliant, interesting people who are doing work in a particular area, who can speak to some timely subject and or non-timely, depending on whether it's interesting or not. And then I do a lot of research before speaking with them. And what comes out are these really well-researched, super interesting, detailed conversations that really run the gamut, whether it's Tim Grover, who was Michael Jordan's strength coach from 1989 until the end of his career, or central bank people like the chief economist of the BIS, or folks like this. And the program is called Hidden Forces because the idea is that there are, in order to understand the world, in order to understand the epiphenomena that we encounter in our daily lives, you're best suited to get as deep as possible down the vector of whatever it is that's driving that system or that behavior. And that's what Hidden Forces is. It's a deeply epistemic approach, and it takes an empirical and epistemic approach and a critical thinking approach to understanding the world, which I think is desperately needed today.
Yeah, spot on. And today we want to talk a bit about sort of also some of the hidden forces of the crypto space, timely enough, sort of the ethics and values, and also some of the excesses that we see in markets today. And I want to start by talking about a phenomenon that I think everyone is aware of at some level, but maybe not under the same name. Some call it postmodernism, others, the casinofication of markets. And in a recent podcast with Grant Williams, you called it financial nihilism. So Dimitri, what is financial nihilism, and why should we care about it?
So I define financial nihilism or market nihilism as an investment philosophy that treats the objects of speculation as though they were intrinsically worthless. And it not only conflates price with value, but it synonymizes the two. And I think this explains partly why so-called narrative investing, to the extent that this is even like a term that anyone uses, has become so popular, because I think that people have always made money by investing in things that before everyone else thinks to invest in them, right?
Right.
But in my experience, we've never really had a philosophy that's so nihilistic and cynical, which says that it's all bullshit. Value is effectively what you can get someone else to pay, bootstrapping a narrative, getting people to believe in something, even if they believe. In many instances, things like scam, like a scam coin or something, or some of these other things. The idea is that everyone's saying, well, let's all just close our eyes, tap our heels 3 times, and the thing will go up. That to me is very new, and it's very nihilistic. And I think that derives from that same type of phenomenon.
Right. And I think it's important sort of to delineate between when we look at Bitcoin, for example, or Ethereum, those are also things that are bootstrapped from nothing. But when they are big and they have a lot of network effect, then they will be valuable because of that, right?
Right. Well, I think that's a great point, right? Because Bitcoin, in a sense, sort of pioneered this, but it pioneered it, and it's at a point now where it has millions and millions and millions of adopters, people that are invested in its success. And I think that's a phenomenon that we see across the board everywhere in life. People try to imitate. They try to fast follow. And so everyone wants to be the next Bitcoin because everyone wants to be rich. So that drives so much of whether it is in crypto or meme stocks or anywhere, there's this desire to be the next Bitcoin, the next Uber, the next Google, but now it's just everything's been tokenized. So the capacity to generate the returns that a Google can generate or an Uber can generate are actually possible because the dividend has gone away, the cash flow is gone. All you need is asset price appreciation. So there's actually a way to get there if you can get enough people to believe in the Ponzi and to buy in early enough so that you can exit at a sufficient multiple. That's the game.
Right. And it seems sort of where for me the nihilism comes in contrast to something like Bitcoin, would be that a lot of people will like straight up tell you that they don't believe in it for the long term. They just want to get in and get out before, others do. And that's how they plan on making money with it, right?
Yeah, and that raises the question of whether utility is important, first and foremost, and then also whether or not having a sort of a long-term vision is important, or is it simply important, is price really all that matters,
Right, yeah. I mean, you raised a very interesting point when you compared this sort of to the rise of growth companies and growth investing. Like when we look back 40 years or 50 years, like the way that someone like Warren Buffett, made their start was, with a sort of cigar butt strategy, right? Sort of look at, companies and only look at their tangible value and completely discard sort of any potential of future growth. And now we seem to have the opposite almost, right? Only looking at future growth.
It's a very momentum-driven investing environment. And that's not entirely surprising when you consider that the ultimate driver of that momentum has been, and that sort of equilibrium of steady increases in price over time have been monetary policy makers. Mm-hmm. They've created an environment, sort of sauce for the goose. Everyone sort of invests in the giant tidal wave that the Fed has created through the massive amounts of liquidity that it's generated. And in that way, particularly Bitcoin, but crypto as a category is really a deep, pure expression of the chaos that has created.
So you would say financial nihilism is primarily a result of, bad policy?
I think it's
central bank failure?
I think it's partly a result of central bank policy. Specifically, what I've talked about is the moment of clarity that normally comes every so often through the contraction of a business cycle. The absence of that moment of clarity and the promise of perpetual mean reversion that has developed both through forward guidance of monetary officials, but subsequently every market participant simply believing that things will just go up. That is very nihilistic because it provides no room for the discretionary investor whose job it is to actually tie price back to value, right? To tie perception to reality if we are operating with an idea that there is some ontological base reality. And incidentally, I think this is also why theories of simulation theories have gotten so popular in the culture, because there is this feeling that reality is less and less relevant or even absent entirely or empirically non-obtainable. I think that also speaks to something else, which is that we just can't appreciate how much our experiential universe has changed over the last, in particular, I'd say 10 years. I think that's where the big change happened, because that's when 10 or a few more years, when ubiquitous connectivity through mobile and social media and networked applications became a huge thing. Mm-hmm. And so I think there is a real sense that the world is less tangible. We spend more time, and as a result of that, we spend more time in the digital world. And because we spend more time in the digital world, we end up running into a problem that has always existed, but that we never really were aware of, because when we live in the world, when I meet you, Hasu, I know if I say that there's Hasu and someone else will say that that's not him, but it's so obviously you because you're in the world. I can see that that's you. Mm-hmm. The onus of proof is on the person who's making the statement that it's not you. But in the digital world, it's very difficult to distinguish truth from fiction, fact from falsehood. And so we run up into another problem, that one of the central problems that crypto is meant to address, which has to do with trust. And how do we trust a world that we can't sort of verify through our bare sensorium as we know it to be true, putting aside legitimate arguments of whether the world as it is, base reality as we perceive it, is actually base reality, and to what degree it has any relationship to reality. Those are fair arguments. But regardless, we were evolved to live in the world. And I think this transition to a digital world, the challenges of making that transition work are deeply underappreciated because of how quickly we've sort of been sucked into it.
You made a very interesting point there regarding inability, to verify things and, tell truth from fiction. Would you say that this motivates maybe to a degree the entire, strive for having a decentralized financial system and, the Web3 narrative, let's build new social media platforms, new internet giants, but this time decentralized and where everybody can, verify the state and so on?
You cut out for a second. Did you say, does it validate the need for, quote, decentralized applications?
Yeah, pretty much. And a decentralized financial system. Because this is such a high value, right? Both in Bitcoin and Ethereum, the ability for anyone to be an actual node in the system and, validate that the rules of the system are being followed. So would you say this is an attempt to reclaim that power?
I do. Yeah, I do. I think the general answer to that is yes, I do. That's sort of the short and succinct answer. I do think so. I think it's, again, you and I know we've talked about this oftentimes. There's a lot of virtue signaling within the community on certain enlightenment values, and many popular advocates in the space fall far short of that. But I absolutely do think this is the correct goal to strive for. I do.
Mm-hmm. In an age where people only seem to care about the price of things, it feels more important than ever to take a moment and reflect on the values that, the crypto community wants to have. What values and ethical codes do you think crypto should represent? And maybe where does it currently fall short of that?
Well, I think, again, the types of virtues or values that we associate with the Enlightenment, like open-mindedness, are ones I think we should strive for. I think a lot of people who speak on behalf of the Bitcoin community fall vastly short of that standard. There's a lot of community policing that happens. There's a lot of ideological cultish worshiping. And that, I think, does not serve the community well. And as someone who isn't impartial towards Bitcoin or Ethereum in any particular way, what I like about the Ethereum community is that there is more of a focus on building. And that actually raises the issue of culture and how these two groups differ, because Bitcoin's culture, unlike Ethereum's, is more, I would say, restorative, whereas Ethereum's culture is more progressive. And I find the latter much more appealing during a time where we face many complex and novel problems and where the promise of the underlying technology of distributed ledgers has so many broad applications. And I would also say, incidentally, that this ethos is far more aligned with the current zeitgeist. And I think we've seen this in the conversations around the energy problem, or you could disagree whether there's an energy problem or not, but let's just put mining and the enormous policy focus and focus through ESG and other areas of the economy on green energy, Green New Deal, stuff like this. So that's sort of how I see that, if that answers your question.
Yeah, sure. Regarding sort of the progressive versus restorative, so you said one fits the current zeitgeist better than the other. Where do you stand on the question if, the same person can sometimes favor restorative ideals and at other times progressive, or versus is it like always two different camps and, sometimes one is more powerful versus the other?
Yeah, no, I think that you can favor both because, again, to bring it to Bitcoin, because it's a tangible example, Bitcoin's value is in its restorative qualities. So you invest in Bitcoin, you want to hold Bitcoin because you don't want too much change. So the same people that can, be working in Ethereum, many of those people, or people that own ETH and or BTC, they own both interchangeably, and people can support both. And these are actually one of the things that people outside the crypto community may not understand as much is that it benefits everyone when Bitcoin goes up in price, or at least it certainly benefits Ethereum. The industry moves in tandem, and that's not necessarily a good thing, but it is what it is for now. So I think that you can support both if you can be in fact, to my point, one of the strong progressive values today in the zeitgeist is environmental conservationism. Well, what is that other than not restorative? So
and,
I do think you can have both.
Can you restore restorative for our audience real quick?
By restorative, I mean kind of make America great again. Make money great again, so to speak, putting out all the pejoratives associated with it. It's kind of like another way of talking about being conservative, you know?
Yeah, I think we're like conservative is about, like favoring keeping things the way they are, unless we are really sure that they must be changed, right? And restorative to me means returning to a better time. Also, like you said, with Make America Great Again, right?
Yeah.
Restore something that has once been. And I think the idea that the Bitcoin community is striving for in a lot of ways is returning to sometimes they talk about sort of the gold standard, but also just about the, maybe a glorified or romanticized version, of America that may not have ever existed, right? The wealth gap is often, mentioned when, their grandparents were able to work for a few years out of college and buy their first house, right? And then get 2 or 3 kids, and have 2 cars and whatnot, right? And they look at themselves and they are burdened with student loan debt. Ever being able to afford their own home seems completely out of reach for them. What do you tell them? Like, is it realistic that this time can even be restored, or do we need to find completely new solutions to these problems?
So these are totally fair observations. And, the wealth gap, and the wealth gap is partly driven by the type of financial repression that we've described.
Yeah.
The same phenomenon that favors asset prices over dividends and fixed income flows. I think this is a really tough question. It's a fair question. It's a tough question. No one really has the answer to this. I find it difficult to see how this trend can continue indefinitely, because in practical terms, what it simply means is that America moves from a more market-oriented, commercial, capitalist, so to speak, free market economy towards one that is increasingly feudalistic, where a smaller and smaller percentage of people in society control the vast majority of all the wealth. And whether that's represented in treasury securities or stocks or anything else, that doesn't work. It creates political volatility in place of the interest rate volatility or financial market volatility that you would normally see, right? So the central banks create this sort of steady upward movement in prices, and in return, you get increasingly political instability. That can't go on forever, which is why I think the central banks, whether they acknowledge it, whether they even understand it entirely consciously or subconsciously, are trying to devalue fiat currencies, because that is a way of achieving a soft default. And the soft default is, I think people view it as the only way that we can redistribute wealth somehow. I don't even know if that works. It's actually very concerning. we all have trouble sleeping at night as a result of this, all of us who deal with this issue. No one really knows how it's going to work out. I mean, you can say it's going to work out really badly and you'll have some kind of political revolution, or you will have a form of international, because we live in a world of nation states, international conflict, because rather than implode, countries will seek to explode onto the international stage. That's what we've seen in the past. It stands to reason that is what will happen again. Things can always change. Maybe also we are reluctant to believe this because it seems so out of scope. But I think every year it becomes easier to believe with some of the things that we've been seeing and how much the global order has changed in the last 10 years. It's sort of unrecognizable, especially in the last 20, since the first administration of the Bush administration.
Yeah, indeed. Also, you drew a very beautiful picture there of, volatility can't be contained, right? It can only be moved around. And just when you thought you had it contained, then it breaks out somewhere else, right? And
yeah, 100%. So that the thing is that, and this is something I talked about on the Grant Williams podcast, which is that in a free market economy, people have economic value and they have political value. If the market becomes increasingly socialized and corrupt, people still have political value. They may not have economic value, especially to a further point with the move towards automation. People increasingly maybe feel like their lives are meaningless. They don't have opportunities to engage in the power process and actually exert their will onto the world and feel like their lives matter. Mm-hmm. But their lives do matter at the ballot box. So that's a dangerous cocktail when and this is why the founders are one of the reasons why the founders are very concerned about, and some pushed for, people like Jefferson pushed for suffrage to be directly attached to property ownership, which was they were very concerned about people being landless. They saw what happened in France. Yeah. And they were concerned about landless revolts and inner city riots of people who didn't care. And we see that in cities when we see rioting and stores being broken and looted. Why is that happening? Because people don't feel invested in their local communities. So, I think, I don't know if I strove off there.
No.
Point I was seeking to make. But.
I really like this tangent. I mean, this is, I think, an underappreciated insight, right? Like, who is the man who becomes, a criminal? It's not the guy who has property and has, a wife and a family and whatnot, right? It's those that feel sort of left behind by society in a sense, right?
Yeah, completely. Exactly. I think that's a powerful framing though, right? Feeling left behind. Even if you have plenty of money, in other words, enough money to be able to live comfortably and exert and not have other people determine your life. I know lots of people who are in that position who are a lot older, who are angry because they feel like the world is leaving them behind. And that, I think, is just a normal intergenerational transition. It just so happens to be that the world is way more different today than it was 10 years ago versus 1980 from 1970. And so people who, came of age in an earlier time find the world even less relatable 10 years, 20 years, 30 years later. And that's another problem. How do we integrate these different conscious experiences into one coherent, workable society? Some people take the view that it's not relevant. Our current nation state political structure isn't relevant in this new world. I don't buy that argument. I haven't been convinced of it because I think that ultimately we do live in the physical world. That's not changing anytime soon. I know there are a lot of people that want to upload their consciousness to the cloud, which is a wholly unscientific endeavor, but that's neither here nor there. And so security matters. And if there is an outgrowth of political terrorism in the United States as a result of some of the forces that we're describing here, that's going to impact all of us, regardless of whether we work remotely or not.
Yeah. They say history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. And what I appreciate about your show so much is that you often bring, you have this grand view, about not just our current times, but also knowing a lot of parallels, right? Zooming out and seeing that, nothing ever happens for the first time. Do you think there are any parallels in history to be found, to what we are seeing right now?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think one parallel is the first industrial revolution in the 19th century. we saw America move from a primarily agrarian and somewhat merchant economy to a largely industrial one. And I think that coincided, not coincidentally, with the Civil War, because while the Civil War was fought over the question of slavery, the means by which the war could be fought, and most certainly won by the North, resulted from the industrialization of the North relative to the South and the power that accumulated politically to the Union. And that was a sort of changing of the guard for the elite and society. So that part, I think, is relevant, as is the industrialization, right? Because you've got a new class of elites that exist today who formed their wealth as a result of primarily a completely new revolution in technology. Mm-hmm. I think similarly, the second industrial revolution, really kind of the late 19th, early 20th century, is another example. What was interesting about that was, one, just the enormous growth in wealth, and much of which accumulated in the hands of a small group of people, of elites, and then subsequently the transfer of that wealth to their children. And that resulted in a very different type of culture in America. Because while the Carnegies and the Rockefellers, John D., Andrew, these folks, or Cornelius Vanderbilt, who actually came into the fold even earlier than those guys, these folks still worked their way up from the ground. Once the wealth transferred to their children, you had this new institutionalized class of elites who increasingly didn't see themselves as Americans. In the case of the United States, they saw them as internationalists. And so their loyalty was more to this sort of to their identity as international elites. I think we're seeing that today as well. And I think the danger at that time was expressed in the form of, so these cults like eugenics, the popularity of eugenics. I think there's some similarities there in the sort of transhumanist movement and other such ideas that really kind of, I don't mean to conflate transhumanists with eugenicists. And I also think it's important to point out that not every eugenicist was a Nazi, right? So this was a larger philosophy, but it had to do with a sense of superiority. And similarly, there was a huge interest in fascism at the time, because fascism was seemed to be such a perfect ideology for business. And so I think there's something similar that we see today with people that are attracted to the Chinese authoritarian model, mm-hmm. people that saw let's say how quickly the Chinese built hospitals during the COVID pandemic. And therefore, there's a strain of the culture that seeks expediency over what I think is stability long-term. And this brings us back also to the point about automation, which is that automation makes people obsolete. And while it is a political liability in the fact that obsolete voters are very dangerous, you do kind of get to what people like Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and people like Bill Joy, co-founder of Sun Microsystems, wrote about in the 90s. And that's where we bring us back to eugenicism and things like this. Do we get a power grab at some point by people who have enormous power, who are in positions to manipulate our minds and our conceptions of reality, not just through intermediation, digital interfaces, et cetera, but the algorithms that tell us what we want, not just give us what we want, but inform increasingly what we desire in the world? I think that's a real danger, the sort of dystopian future that is a lot closer than I think most of us realize.
I think we have painted a pretty dire picture
well, it is
of the world as it is today. I would like to explore a bit how, as a young person today, as I assume most of our audience is going to be, how you can navigate this world and how you can make your own path and not become nihilist yourself, but be strong, principled, and learn to stick to those, maybe?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I guess I don't know why it strikes me as tough immediately. Maybe the transition from doom and gloom to, and I'm not a doom and gloom guy.
Yeah, you're not. Yeah,
I'm not actually. And when I spoke about the point about social media and these companies really having a pipeline into our brain and being able to manipulate our wants and desires, I'm also inspired by the work of people like Shoshana Zuboff and others that I've had on my show, who have really done a lot of work to inform people about this. And I think there's been an awakening in the zeitgeist around regulation of these companies. Can you rephrase that question again? Sorry, Hasu.
Yeah. Is there anything that you would tell like a young person who
right.
Wants to live in this world?
Well, I actually look to people. It's funny that you're old when you no longer think of yourself as a young person, but I think that I actually look at people who are in their early 20s or late teens for inspiration on this. I feel like it's hard for me to imagine how to make it in this world. I think it's important to make allies and to make allies with people who have lived for some period of time before you and maybe are in positions of power. Yeah, I guess I'm sorry I don't have a better answer.
No, it's all fine. I mean, maybe we can take it from here. Like to me, some answers would come to mind based on what you said earlier. For example, if we realize that maybe the family model, like where you have a property, you have a family at 25, you have kids, like it's almost like you work the same job like your entire life. How we can try to recreate some of the same benefits,
I see what you're saying,
but in a completely digitized and international world.
Yeah.
And it struck me what you said about, you need allies. I think it's very important in this day and age to invest in relationships, right? Because it can feel like, due to the constant connectivity, it can feel like you're connected to many people all the time, but the relationships can be very superficial and ultimately not fulfilling, when sometimes it might be better to disconnect and invest strongly into fewer but deeper relationships.
I totally agree. And actually that does raise something, which is, I think there is that, we've talked about the nihilism and the cynicism. I don't think people should be engaging in this type of thinking. And I also think that one of the problems that we have today is that these social media platforms, which are effectively the public squares of the age, are adversarial environments. They are not open town halls for discussion. And that's a big problem. And that wasn't always true. It wasn't always true on social media, and it just wasn't always true, period. And we need that. And I think ultimately that comes, a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of that stems from a lack of self-policing of oneself. Not of others, because I think we do a lot of that. There's a lot of throwing bricks through glass houses. And I think what we need to do is and there are people that do work in this area. In fact, my guest who I just interviewed and whose episode comes out on Monday, Andy Norman, wrote a book called Mental Immunity, where much of it is about how do we find a way to reason together, to be able to establish and hold ground rules for conversation so that every conversation doesn't devolve into a zero-sum game. Conversation should be a positive-sum game so that we all get something out of it. Just the same way that training ahead of a competition, ahead of a fight, you don't train to kill your sparring partner. You train in order to make both of you better so that you can then meet a challenge in the real world and be that much better for it. So I think maybe developing a less cynical attitude towards conversation and moving away from argument and more towards constructive conversation and not assuming the worst in other people. So if I were to have any advice, I would say we kind of need to change again, this speaks to something we haven't talked about, which is narcissism. People are so narcissistic. They're so self-involved, and they don't even realize how self-involved they are because they're so self-involved. But people who aren't that self-involved can see that in their Twitter feeds, can see that in their interviews. And a great example of someone like this is Grant Williams. I mentioned him before I was on his podcast, and I thanked him at the end. And I told him that for me, Grant is really a sort of idol that I look at and I look towards for inspiration and guidance on how to behave in the world, because it's very easy in the world that we live in to focus very much on oneself and what I can get, whether it's money or whether it's acclaim, and not understanding that we are part of a whole. Our actions, especially if we're in the public world, have an impact, and they impact other people, and people look towards that. Younger people will look towards that for inspiration. So I think that's very important for sure.
Yeah, we keep circling back to the social media companies, right? But they are designed intricately in a way to bring out these negative traits in you, right?
Yeah. I
saw a really good meme almost like a few months ago where someone mapped the 7 large tech companies to the 7 deadly sins. And I think, Instagram was vain and Facebook was narcissism, and it was something around these lines, right? And I feel like it's really true how they bring that out in you.
Yeah, well, they're meant to amplify engagement, and there are aspects of the human animal that favor sensationalism, favor controversy, favor conflict over peace and, getting along. So I think a lot of those things get exploited, and that's where I think we do need regulation. There was a strong push for it, interestingly enough, under the Trump administration. I hear less of it now.
Regulation of what?
Regulation of social media companies. Social media companies are not normal companies. They are utilities. They should be treated as such. And I say they are utilities. They're not treated as utilities. They are performing a public service. They're very much like the news division of a corporation, but even more important because they are where we communicate. They're where we share ideas. They're where we come to consensus about ideas as a culture. And the idea that those should be controlled by a commercial entity whose business model is based on advertising is so obviously a bad idea. It's one of the worst ideas ever. The only reason it hasn't been reformed is because the commercial interests in control of it have employed massive amounts of money in the form of lobbyists in Washington to ensure that nothing will get in their way. So I think this is one of the big battles of the next few years, the next however many years. I don't know. I can't say the next 10 years because waiting 10 years, even waiting 5 years feels like crazy to me. So, this is a huge issue. We can't have a functioning liberal democracy without a public square that at the very least leans towards objectivity. And we are far from that right now.
What are the kinds of regulations that you would like to see for social media companies?
There are people, I'm blanking on the name now, Jessica something I think is her name, but there are, and someone who writes about this and is in touch with a lot of these folks is, I'm blanking on, I had him on my show, Matt, I'm forgetting his name now. He writes the blog Big. And so I can't tell you exactly what regulations. I think, for example, the spirit of net neutrality, that needs to carry over to the fact that the censoring is not just happening at the information layer. It's actually now happening on the software layer. It's not just in the hardware. It's not just cable companies censoring content and packets of information. This is now happening on the platform level with companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, whatever. So that attempt to kind of level the playing field has to happen there as well. And I think, and this is without having studied it very carefully, and I would love to hear what other people have to say about it, is it seems to me that this entire business model of trafficking people's attention and clicks for ad dollars is toxic. It shouldn't exist. And I would favor, in light of if there not being anything better, I would be in favor of banning it entirely, because I think it's one of those things that's clearly horrible for everyone except for very few people who can profit from it, and even they will protect their kids. I was just in Kauai. This is a great example. I was in Hawaii, and there's an island in Hawaii called Kauai where they filmed Jurassic Park, Tropic Thunder. In fact, I passed by Ben Stiller's house, but more importantly, who was the director of Tropic Thunder. I wish I didn't pass in his house because I don't know Ben Stiller, but if Ben Stiller's an ETH head,
and if he's listening right now,
listening, Ben,
please reach out.
love you. But I also passed by, from a great distance, Mark Zuckerberg's house. Mark Zuckerberg has purchased, through all sorts of covert processes, a huge area of land in Kauai, and he employs a huge security detail to ensure that no one can get close to it. And why do I bring this up? Mark Zuckerberg has told us that privacy is a sort of bygone thing. It's not important. We're over it. Move past that. But he wants privacy. He wants privacy for himself. He buys all the houses around his house on the West Coast. Why? Because he wants privacy. So I think you said something that made me bring that up. I wasn't just ripping on Mark Zuckerberg. I think it had to do with the Right. That was my point.
The 7 cents.
And my point is the only reason that it's not important to Mark Zuckerberg is because he has the money to be able to create that privacy and to be able to protect his own children.
Yeah.
So it's the same. Steve Jobs didn't let his kids use certain products, some of his own products. I doubt Mark Zuckerberg lets his kids open up a Facebook account, unless it's like a private intranet account or something.
Yeah, I read a book last year, and now I'm blanking on the name, but the gist of the book was it laid out how the super rich can buy all kinds of benefits, like privacy, like immunity from law, and they are like not that difficult ways you can buy everything with money, and everything has a price.
Which is the hallmark of a corrupt society and a banana republic.
Maybe, yeah, but it wasn't local in nature, this phenomenon, but it was deeply global. It had to do with regulatory arbitrage, because there was always a place where you can get exactly what you want if you're willing to, expand your reach. And this actually deeply reaffirmed my belief in the value proposition of crypto. Because if you can buy everything with money, then maybe the right way, like maybe those holes can't be closed. Maybe that's the wrong approach. Maybe the approach is to make it, just as cheap as possible and as easy to get, just democratize access to these things like financial privacy.
Right. So the question is, how would you do that? Would you do that through government regulation?
I don't know.
Because then you have the problem of the sort of who will guard the guardians, which is that you have to overcome these enormous blocks to regulatory change, to sort of progressive regulatory change, which are the companies and the individuals who have captured the government. And this is why it's difficult. You kind of run into the problem of like, how do we get from here to there, And is it going to be violent? And is it going to be difficult? And it's certainly going to be difficult,
I mean, I see crypto as a bottom-up experiment almost, in competing with things that can only be done via top-down policy otherwise. Because for the private market, it's not possible to bring up, a solution that grants financial privacy from the state. It's never going to be tolerated. But if it's a cryptocurrency, maybe, right?
If it's a cryptocurrency, what?
Then maybe it has a chance to...
What has a chance?
It has a chance to grow, into existence where it can be used by a lot of people and be accessible.
That a cryptocurrency or a platform, you're talking about, sorry, I must have missed that. You're talking about a decentralized social media platform?
Oh, no, just, financial privacy.
Oh, financial
Some
privacy.
kind of financial decentralized applications, like store of value, that kind of stuff. I mean, it's not great privacy, but it's some privacy, right? It's not the kind of privacy that Mark Zuckerberg can afford for himself, but
I think there are certain areas where you can create, but I don't know. I think there are certain areas where you can create privacy in the commercial realm by using a different, incentive and wealth redistribution model, essentially having an open source, quote decentralized platform with token issuance. I think there are places that you can do that. Maybe I need to graduate from the realm of skepticism in general in crypto because of so many of the things that do make people skeptical. Again, long-term believer, short-term, there's a lot of noise to sift through, but sure, I think in principle, yes.
Let's talk about that actually, like your skeptical position on crypto. You say you are a long-term believer. What does it take for you to become a short to medium-term believer as well?
Good question. For example, for DeFi, one of the things that's been disappointing, a little disappointing, but more simply uninspiring, I would say, is that DeFi, as I see it, is primarily used as a tool for financial regulatory arbitrage and gambling. And so it's no different, in my view, than, if anything, it's just more, it offers more opportunities to gamble than traditional financial markets, at least in terms of, for the size of the market, the kind of opportunities to gamble. I would like to see, whether it's in DeFi or anywhere else, I would like to see a major launch of a really widely used application. So if it were in DeFi, a lending protocol that, let's say in the developed world, really made huge changes in economic opportunity for people. But also, again, because this is financial services, I think there are huge risks in DeFi as the network grows, because not just because it's unregulated, but because these systems don't just have complexity in code, they also have the complexity of the financial layer. And you basically have these two forces working together, and they can create a lot of volatility and a lot of instability. And the traditional financial system prior to central banking was obviously much more volatile, and you had instances of bank runs and firms going under because of the nature of how banking works and leverage works. But you didn't have those forces combined with the complexity of actually writing software and all the sort of unintended consequences that come with that. So I think there's still a lot to work through. I think it's interesting. But you and I have talked about this before. I actually think I was optimistic about how the tokenization of software would drive capital into a space and allow the market to effectively crowdsource interesting projects. And that I found this to be a superior model to government grants and things like this, which I found to be, full of corruption. But when I've actually studied, if you actually look at how some of the foundational open source protocols were developed in the United States, they were developed through close collaboration between the government, academia, and ultimately passing that off to the commercial sector to commercialize it. And the military, exactly right. So the government, I throw the military in together, but that model worked very well. And I think one of the reasons why it worked so well is because, when you're a creative and you're an innovator, you need a space to be free, to think without constraints, and to create without any particular objective. Vannevar Bush created an outfit like this during World War II. And a lot of things like microwave radar that was put onto bombers in the Atlantic that actually took out all the submarines, the Nazi submarines that allowed American vessels to cross the Atlantic and to refuel. This is before the United States entered the war, and to rearm and provide supplies to the British and to the Allies. That was possible because of the ability to separate the military, which needed stringent, very much like a commercial operation, and the academic sector, academia, think tanks, etc. So I think there's a real benefit there that's lost in the current model because there's so much focus on the token and the price. How do we get the price up? And I think that's a real cost. Some people might quibble or argue, well, it's okay, it's a cost, but it's not, the benefits are greater. I don't know if the benefits are greater, to be honest. I think a lot of money's been wasted in this space and scammed, and et cetera, because of this.
I think I have a practical question for you. Some DeFi coins choose to launch a token immediately, have a trade on secondary markets, because they see this as part of the feedback loop, right? It creates an aligned community of early investors. Sometimes, like some of them even become contributors. They use it to incentivize, liquidity provision and adoption. But others keep the token on the back burner. They don't even launch it. Eventually they will, right? Because the way that I like to think about it is this is sort of the equivalent of going public, like the going public moment of a new company. And some like to take years to launch a token, right? DYDX is sort of a derivatives exchange that does this, has been live for like 3 or 4 years now and still doesn't have a token. But sort of where do you stand on this? And maybe also in the light of private, like if you look at regular companies, they take longer and longer to go public, where public markets investors can buy them for the first time. And this, at least it seems to contribute to the rising wealth gap, right? Because a lot of wealth is now created and captured exclusively in the private markets compared to, like, for example, when Microsoft went public and all of that wealth was subsequently created in the public markets. Yeah, where do you stand on this with regards to DeFi?
That's a really great question. I think one, there's an incentive for people to launch a token earlier and earlier because not just to raise capital, but this, you mentioned it, build a community. And I think it's one of those things where I understand why people do it, even if they aren't necessarily interested in raising more capital. And but I would have to say that again, the benefits of community are enormous. I mean, it's something that I have to acknowledge. It's something that I underappreciated. I mean, I appreciated it, But I didn't appreciate it as much as I have now, because I think people want and need community. And it speaks to the sense of loneliness and being left behind and nihilism that we talked about earlier. But I think on par, it's always better to wait. And a lot of times projects, this, will launch tokens that aren't necessary at all. And there's so much noise in the channel when it comes to this. So on average, I would prefer not to see another token launched. I would prefer companies and teams work in a more traditional way. And I don't know that it's necessary to launch a token. You can find ways to incentivize people the way early startups have done that before with early equity.
Okay. So let me actually challenge you on that. If the token is the equity, then I feel like every project has a token. It just may not be
that's different. It's not publicly traded.
Markets.
Right.
Yes,
so
exactly.
I think that's my point. I think that's where I think it's problematic. Launching something so early, going public as a startup, I think that's problematic. That's what I mean.
Yeah. I see. Yes, I think that is exactly the right framing. And surprisingly, nobody uses that, right? In DeFi, sort of thinking about launching the token as the going public moment and, really evaluating the pros and cons of that. So
yeah.
I only thought about that in this discussion.
Yeah. Are we getting signal to go off stage?
We can wrap it up sometime in the next.
I'm happy
minutes.
not to wrap it up. I just want to make sure. Yeah. This is very complicated for me, these sort of digital stages.
I have it under control.
Yeah. Okay. You got it.
We have one or two more audience questions. We could take one more. So someone asked them, why do you think current money is not great? What defines great money for you? It's a bit of a topic.
Yeah, so this is a really tough question. I used to be fundamentally a sound money guy. I also recognize, the gold standard is a great example. Over time, Alan Greenspan made this argument, and he made the argument, again, Alan Greenspan went through a long transition, some might say opportunistic, self-serving transition from being a gold bug, Randian, to the head of the central bank, and really in some ways a transformative central bank chief. But he made the argument that really the gold standard is irrelevant because in order to have a functioning gold standard, you need to have an honest government. And if you don't have an honest government, well, I guess he was talking about the Bretton Woods standard. I think the way our understanding of the gold standard and sound money is we idealize it, but it came with a lot of problems. So in place of an institutional elite, we had a commercial elite who was what the people called the banking trust. There's a reason why bankers are so unpopular in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and why progressive populist movements grew up against the trust. So the issue for me tends to be power and the accumulation of power. I think if I had to pick one, I would pick sound money. But that also is very self-serving because I would benefit from such a model. And I don't know ultimately in the long term if it is sustainable. And I wonder, Hasu, to that point, you know what? I should say, I think one of the challenges we have with these types of conversations is everyone's always looking for the perfect model, But I tend to find that what happens in history is people are very clever and they always find ways to upend any existing framework or model. And that always leads to revolution and renewal. So, the fiat model is clearly broken. The sound money model, whether it's in Bitcoin or gold, creates lots of inequities. This is where politics comes into the picture and why you can never really get rid of people unless you have a world of machines. But if people have power, you need politics because politics is what causes that renewal process where people can work things out. And war is politics by other means. So sometimes politics breaks down and you have open conflict. And that's just human. So I don't think there's an ideal model. I prefer a sound money model where I can save my money, but that model also comes with other costs. So,
okay, man, I'm so sad that we are out of time because
it was good.
I also have a take on fiat money, but this is the end for us. Dimitri, thank you so much for the discussion.
My pleasure.
Please, everyone, check out Hidden Forces. Great podcast.
Hiddenforces.io. You can check out our episode library and go and geek out. It's a great program. Thank you, Hasu.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Today's episode of Hidden Forces was recorded in New York City. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io. hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page at patreon.com/Hidden Forces. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.